The first thing I want to tell you is this. Silence can weigh more than stone, and I have carried it on my back for over 7 decades. Not just any silence, but one filled with invisible scars, with words swallowed alongside tears, with nights when I wished I could vanish. And though my hands tremble and my voice cracks, I have decided that I will not die with this secret buried inside my chest. My name is Alzira Matthews. I'm 78 years old, and in my neighborhood in San Antonio, everyone knows me as the old woman in the floral dress who spends her afternoons watering plants in her yard. They see me smile among my roses and daisies and believe I live in peace. What they don't know is that behind those flowers, I hide a garden of poisoned memories, which no amount of water has ever managed to wash away. It has taken me a lifetime to gather the courage to speak. Old age, with all its aches, brings a strange kind of freedom. I no longer fear gossip, nor do I care about being judged. What truly frightens me is dying without leaving my truth in the air, as if unspoken it would vanish. That's why tonight, even with a shaky voice, I open the door to my story. If you're listening, I ask you something from my heart. Stay with me. Subscribe, leave a like, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It's not vanity. Every gesture from you is proof that my voice isn't lost in the void, that someone is there on the other side, holding me as I travel through these memories. I remember believing as a child that life was simple, that everything could be solved with a loaf of bread fresh from the oven, or a shared laugh under the sun. But I learned far too early that life can also be cruel, that it can rip away what you love without asking permission, and that behind a caress may hide a strike. That was my earliest lesson. I'm not sharing this to ask for pity. I'm sharing because my heart feels heavier the closer I get to the end of my days, and I need to empty it. The strange thing is, as I grow older, I feel an even stronger urge to return to my beginnings, to the childhood that taught me to run barefoot, and also to fear. My story deserves to be told, even if my voice falters. Speaking of it tears me in two. Part of me is still that little girl trembling in silence, hiding in the corners of a house that no longer exists. The other part, the old woman I am now, knows it's too late to change what happened, but not too late to make others understand what it means to survive. And maybe in telling, I too will find peace. So here I am, stripped of pretty words and excuses, showing you the wound as it is. Because what destroyed my childhood wasn't only my mother's death, but what came after. The arrival of a man who wore promises like a mask. And even if it breaks me, I will guide you through every corner of that memory, step by step, tear by tear. My childhood began in a small wooden house, the kind where sunlight slipped through. The cracks and winter winds rattled the walls. It stood on the edge of a little town in Texas, surrounded by cotton fields that stretched endlessly under the blue sky. Each morning, the rooster's crow woke us before dawn, and I opened my eyes with a heart light as air, because life still seemed like an endless game. My mother was the soul of our home. She rose with the first noise of the mockingbirds, her hands still heavy with sleep, and lit the fire in the clay oven. The smell of fresh bread was like a promise that the day would be good. That scent, mingled with wood smoke and black coffee, is something I can still taste in memory, even now. My father was a man of few words and broad shoulders. His pride was in the harvest, the rows of cotton, the corn shining golden in the sun, and the pecan trees heavy with nuts. I used to watch him with fascination as he dug into the earth, his hands worn but gentle, as if the soil itself was sacred. From him I learned that the land gives back what you give it. We were 4 siblings, and together we were a flood of laughter and bare feet. We ran across dusty paths, built forts out of sticks, and carved boats that we floated in the irrigation ditches. We made dolls out of rags and clay, and when the heat grew unbearable, we dipped into the creek to cool off. Our wealth wasn't measured in coins, but in the joy of those simple games. I remember my mother braiding my hair in front of the cracked mirror that hung on the kitchen wall. She sang old songs, soft and sweet, while her hands moved with infinite patience. I would look at her out of the corner of my eye, convinced there was no one more beautiful. Her laughter was my shelter, her arms my shield. Falling asleep against her chest was the safest place in the world. Evenings were their own kind of magic. Without electricity, we lit oil lamps that glowed yellow as though we lived inside a storybook. We sat around the table, and my father, with his deep voice, told us stories of his youth, stories of long roads, of hard years, of wars and hunger. I listened wide-eyed, as if he spoke of another world, not realizing that someday my memories would mirror his struggles. Summers filled the town with life. The women washed clothes at the river, beating them against the stones while laughing together, their voices carrying across the water. Children splashed and played nearby, their shouts ringing out like music. Everything was community. Everything was shared. Sometimes I think those were the last pure moments of innocence before shadows crept into our lives. And oh, the county fair. Once a year it transformed the town. Music floated through the air, fiddles and banjos, laughter and stomping feet. I remember the bright lights, the wooden horses on the carousel, the taste of candied apples and cinnamon sweets. I felt like the luckiest girl alive when Mama tied a new ribbon in my hair. Happiness then was so simple, yet so immense. School was held in an old stone building with wooden desks carved by generations of restless children. The teacher was strict, but her heart was kind. She taught me to read, letter by letter, and books became my wings. They carried me far from that little town, into worlds I could only dream of. Every day followed a rhythm of small miracles. My father came home sunburned and weary. Mama gathered us for hot stew, and after a short rest, we went out again into the fields. Yes, life was hard, but there was always a smile, a kind touch, a silence that felt like peace. Back then, we didn't see ourselves as poor. Poverty didn't exist in our minds because we didn't know any other way of living. What we did know was warmth. Warmth of arms around us, of shared laughter, of the certainty that at night someone would tuck us in and whisper a blessing before we closed our eyes. The seasons marked our lives. Winter meant gathering close to the fire with stories. Spring dressed the fields with wildflowers, and I ran among the blue bonnets and daisies. Summer was sweat, river water, and cicadas singing. Fall was pecans dropping from trees and cotton ready for harvest. Each season had its beauty, and we lived it as if it would never end. There was a pecan tree in our yard, tall and sprawling. It became my confidant, my secret place. I climbed its branches with a book in my hands, or sometimes just to cry where no one could see me. Its trunk was strong beneath my arms, and I hugged it as if it could understand. That tree became my symbol of resistance, long before I knew what that word meant. If I close my eyes now, I still hear the church bells echoing across town. Their sound ordered our lives, calling us to Sunday service, to markets, to weddings and funerals. For me, they were like a heartbeat, steady and constant, reminding me that life had a rhythm and meaning. Mama's hands were never idle. She taught me to sew, to cook, to tend to the plants. A woman must know how to care for her own, she would say. At the time, I didn't understand the weight of her words. Years later, I realized she had been planting seeds of strength in me, preparing me for battles she never saw. My siblings were my truest companions. Though we fought over small things, we always shared what little we had: an orange, a piece of bread, even a secret dream. That bond became my anchor, the one thing that held me steady when the storm came. Looking back, I think the happiness of those days lived in the smallest details. A song, Addie. Dusk, Mama's hand stroking my hair, the taste of warm bread. Life was simple, but it was whole. I believed nothing could ever break that harmony. The truth is, the most beautiful thing about my childhood was the illusion. We lived with the certainty that tomorrow would be just as good as today. And that illusion, that innocence, was what made the rupture that followed strike us with such violence. We never imagined that life could change overnight. The first crack in my world came as a whisper. No one wanted to hear my mother's cough. At first it was just a small thing, a rough sound after long days of work. We thought it was tiredness, that a bit of tea and rest would cure it. But the cough grew deeper, sharper, and soon it filled our nights with dread. I was only a girl, but I began to understand that strength could vanish from even the strongest body. I remember the nights awake, my father sitting at her side, his face carved with worry, while my siblings and I huddled together in the corner. Her breathing grew short and shallow, and the hands that once kneaded bread and braided my hair now trembled when they tried to hold ours. I wanted to believe she would rise in the morning, but deep inside, I felt the world slipping from me. When she passed, the house fell silent. It was as if someone had ripped the heart right out of us. The clay oven stayed cold, the songs disappeared, and even the pecan tree in the yard looked bare. My father, once as solid as stone, seemed to shrink into himself. His eyes no longer looked at the earth, but at the emptiness. For us children, losing her was like losing the sun. We wandered lost in the dark. The days after blurred into a parade of neighbors bringing food, endless prayers at church, and words of comfort that healed nothing. Everyone said time would help, but I only felt it stealing more from me. Her voice, her laugh, the warmth of her embrace. I was terrified of forgetting her, so I repeated her memory in my mind each night, like a prayer I couldn't let go of. And then he appeared. A man we barely knew, a distant uncle, my father's brother, came back to town, claiming he wanted to help. He arrived with soft words, generous gestures, and promises to hold us together. People respected him, admired him, and my father, worn down by grief, let him into our home. At first it seemed like a blessing. He handled the crops, managed the bills, even showed kindness to us children. The neighbors said we were lucky to have him. I wanted to believe it too, to cling to any scrap of hope. But soon I felt something shifting, a shadow creeping into every corner of our house. My father's voice grew smaller with each passing day. The man took his place at the table, made the decisions, spoke as though the house belonged to him. What had once been our refuge began to feel borrowed, foreign. I watched in silence, confused by how quickly laughter had turned into stiffness. Outside, the neighbors praised him. They saw only his helpfulness, his charm, his devotion at church. "You're blessed to have such a man caring for you," they told me. I forced a smile, swallowing the dread in my throat. But deep inside, unease was blooming like a thorn I couldn't pull out. The grief for my mother turned into a heavy silence that wrapped around us. My siblings cried in secret. I pretended to be strong, and my father seemed like a ghost among us. Meanwhile, the uncle's presence grew larger, filling every space, stretching its shadow across our lives. And that's when I began to understand, though I couldn't yet name it. Losing my mother hadn't been the greatest tragedy. The true misfortune was the space her absence left, a void wide enough to let the darkest presence walk right in. From the very first day, my uncle moved through the house as if it already belonged to him. He placed his belongings in our cupboards, sat at the head of the table, and gave orders with the authority of a man who had earned nothing yet, claimed everything. To us children, he made us feel small, insignificant. His politeness at first was a mask, one I quickly began to see through. There was something in his gaze that unsettled me, a lingering stare that made my skin prickle. He touched my shoulder too long when praising me, or pulled me closer when telling his stories. No one else seemed to notice, and I, still a child, didn't know how to name the discomfort crawling under my skin. My father defended him at every turn. He said his brother was an honest man, that he had sacrificed his own life to take care of us. But I looked at my father and saw a man beaten down, too tired to resist. The authority in our home had shifted and I felt powerless to stop it. Soon came the commands. Do this. Bring that. Don't talk back. His voice snapped like a whip, cutting sharp, leaving no space for refusal. If we disobeyed, punishment followed quickly. Harsh words, stinging slaps, or worse, the kind of scorn that made you feel smaller than dirt. Fear began to take root inside me, heavy and constant. The first abuses weren't bruises, but secrets. He asked me to do little things apart from my siblings. Bring him food when no one was looking, wash his clothes separately, walk with him alone. Small acts of obedience that pulled me into his shadow. When I tried to resist, the coldness of his eyes was enough to silence me. Control seeped into every corner. My brothers stopped laughing, their eyes darting nervously at the smallest sound. Even the youngest learned to stay quiet, to keep out of his way. The house became strange, ruled by invisible laws we all understood, but never spoke aloud. Sleep abandoned me. I woke at the slightest creaks the floorboards, heart racing, ears straining for his footsteps. I found hiding places, under the bed, behind the pecan tree, even in the chicken coop. Any spot where I could feel out of his reach was a brief escape, but true safety never lasted. In town, he was the perfect man. At church he prayed loudly, greeted everyone with respect, even made people laugh. You're lucky, neighbors told us. Not every family has someone so devoted. I smiled and nodded, though inside I screamed. His shadow followed me everywhere, even into the classroom where I once felt free. Punishments grew harsher. If the crops failed, it was our fault. If money ran short, we were accused of waste. Any excuse served him to remind us of our dependence. My father, worn thin, tried to mediate, but his words carried no weight anymore, mine even less. His cruelty was not only in blows, but in silence. A stare that froze my legs, a smirk that made my stomach knot. He didn't always need to touch me. Sometimes just being watched felt like the worst prison of all. My siblings bore their pain differently. The eldest fought back, and for that he endured the hardest strikes. The youngest cried quietly into his blanket. I became the obedient one, the good girl, swallowing fear in hopes of avoiding the worst. But obedience was its own trap, tightening around me each day. At times he whispered things that confused me more than his orders. You're my favorite, he said. You should be grateful for my attention. Words like venom, sinking into me, twisting guilt and fear together. How could I tell anyone when even I didn't understand what was happening? School no longer gave me wings. Even there, I felt his eyes on me, sometimes in person, sometimes only in memory. The books that once carried me far away lost their shine under his watchful shadow. My dreams soured into nightmares. Mama appeared, reaching out, but I never managed to touch her. I woke sweaty, heart racing, and sometimes saw him standing in the doorway just watching. The dark became unbearable, filled with the threat of his presence. I started wearing bigger clothes, loose dresses to hide my body. I wanted to disappear, to erase myself. I stopped looking in the mirror, afraid of the reflection of a girl I no longer recognized. Days dragged endlessly. Each hour was a calculation, how to move, what to say, when to stay silent. Living wasn't natural anymore. It was a strategy for survival. I dreamed of running away, but dreams were all I had. Reality reminded me that I was only a child, with nowhere to go, no one to trust. The house had once been a safe harbor, but under him it became a cage without bars. His greatest weapon was convincing us that we were nothing without him. He repeated it until it lodged in my mind. Slowly, I began to doubt myself, to believe his lies. That was his real victory. Not the blows, but the theft of my own confidence. We children were no longer the ones who laughed barefoot in the fields. Our bond became quiet, a shield of glances and gestures. We didn't speak of the pain, but we carried it together. Even the house itself seemed to bend under his weight. The oven stayed cold, the walls bare, the pecan tree stopped giving as it once had. Everything wilted in. his presence, and I too, piece by piece, shrank into silence, believing this would be my life forever. The cruelest part was how convincing his mask remained to others. No one suspected. He was praised, admired, trusted. We lived in two worlds, the one everyone saw and the one only we knew. And in that split, I learned one of the hardest truths, that evil often wears the face of kindness, and few are willing to believe otherwise. I became an expert at silence. Silence was my armor, the only shield I had against a man who seemed untouchable. Every word I swallowed was a defense, every hidden tear a secret I clung to. I learned to walk softly, to make myself small, to disappear inside the very walls of my own home. Mornings were the hardest. Waking to the sound of his boots in the kitchen was enough to twist my stomach into knots. I rose carefully, moving like a shadow, obeying without hesitation. My life was no longer mine. It existed only to serve his commands. My siblings watched, me with wide, tired eyes. They too had to learn their own ways of survival. The oldest buried himself in field work, the youngest in solitary play. I became the quiet one, the dutiful girl who never talked back. It cost me hidden sobs and sleepless nights, but it was the only way to avoid the worst punishments. School was no longer a refuge. My teacher, who once encouraged me, began to ask why I seemed so distracted, why my grades had slipped. I lied easily, telling her I was tired, that I missed my mother. It was simpler to invent excuses than to risk speaking the truth. My body began to betray the pain my voice hid. Dark circles under my eyes, shoulders hunched, hands that shook without reason. When I looked into the cracked mirror in the kitchen, I hardly recognized myself. The girl staring back seemed hollow, voiceless. Nights were torment. Insomnia clung to me like a shadow. I often slept fully dressed, as if layers of fabric could guard me. I prayed silently, begging that each night pass quickly, that I would not hear his footsteps at my door. I found places to hide. The pecan tree became my companion, its wide branches my secret refuge. Sometimes I huddled beneath it, hugging my knees, trying to vanish. Other times I hid in the chicken coop, choking on dust and feathers, grateful for even that brief escape. Fear even showed in my clothing. I began wearing long sleeves, dresses too big for me, anything to cover my body, to erase myself. I wanted to become invisible. Mirrors became my enemy. They reminded me of the body I wished I could leave behind. Still, there were moments of tenderness that kept me alive. A glance from my brothers, a hand squeezing mine under the table, a piece of bread shared when I had none. Those small acts of love reminded me I wasn't completely alone, that our bond hadn't been destroyed. By then, my uncle had claimed every corner of our home. He ruled the money, the crops, even our words. Any protest was crushed with immediate punishment. Fear hung in the air so thick that breathing felt like labor. My father had disappeared into himself. He walked through the house like a ghost, broken and resigned. Seeing him defeated hurt worse than any strike, because it reminded me there was no one left to protect us. The man I once leaned on was gone, and I had to learn to hold myself up alone. The silence wasn't just mine. It belonged to the whole family. Each of us carried pain privately, never speaking of it. We acted as if silence could erase it, but it only dug us deeper into despair. Over time, I learned to read his moods. I could tell by his footsteps, the tone of his voice, the way he set a glass on the table. My survival depended on noticing everything. Every small detail became a warning sign. I turned myself into a strategist. I knew when to nod, when to bow my head, when to force a smile. It was like playing a role, acting as someone else, a girl obedient enough to survive. Pain lived in my body, as much as in my heart. Some nights I ached from hidden marks, bruises beneath clothes, scars invisible to anyone but me. I learned to walk stiffly, to keep tears from spilling, to swallow every cry. I tried to hold on to my mother in memory. I closed my eyes and pictured her voice, her laughter, her lullabies. But the more I tried, the fainter she became. Fear was erasing even my most beautiful memories. Guilt took root as well. I blamed myself for not fighting, for not screaming. I wondered if maybe I had brought this on, if it was my fault. That guilt became another chain, binding me in silence. Sundays at church were bitter irony. I watched him pray with fervor, speak kindly to the priest, shake hands with neighbors. What a righteous man, they said. I sat there with clasped hands and a locked jaw, shouting silently in a place where no one could hear me. Time dragged me into adolescence. My body changed, but my voice remained caged. Each year added weight to my silence, pressing me further down. Hunger abandoned me. Food had no taste anymore. I pushed meals away, my body weakening, but no one noticed. Each of us was too busy surviving our own private battles. At night I longed to vanish. I stared at the sky through the window, wondering what it would feel like to fly away like the birds crossing the horizon. Those dreams of escape were my only breath of freedom. Isolation pulled me further from other children. I stopped playing, stopped laughing. My classmates looked at me curiously, puzzled by my seriousness. But no one asked too many questions. Pain has a way of frightening people into silence too. Each day blurred into the next, fear, silence, obedience. Yet deep inside, a spark survived, small, faint, but alive. That tiny flame whispered that this would not last forever. My uncle believed he had broken me completely. He saw my bowed head, my quiet ways, and thought I was his. But he didn't see what I carried inside, a secret hope, stubborn and hidden, that whispered of freedom. That hope became my anchor. I didn't know how or when, but I promised myself I would not remain his prisoner forever. Even if only in my heart, I had begun to resist. Silence had saved me until then, but slowly I realized it could also kill me inside. One afternoon, while fetching water at the town well, I overheard women talking about courage, about how even the weakest could find strength when least expected. They weren't speaking about me, but their words planted themselves deep in my chest. My first act of resistance was tiny, a whispered no when he ordered me to scrub something right away. His eyes froze me, sharp as always, but then he chuckled and dismissed it. That night I realized the world didn't collapse if I defied him, even if it was barely a breath of defiance. I began to study him carefully. I noticed his patterns, his habits, his moments of weakness. When he drank too much, his voice slowed. When the harvest went well, he relaxed and forgot to watch us as closely. I became a quiet observer, storing away details like secret weapons. School slowly became a fragile refuge again. My teachers started looking at me differently. She didn't press, but she left extra books on my desk, gave me tasks that made me feel capable, valued. I think she sensed something was wrong. Her small gestures reminded me that another world existed, one where I could be more than a victim. A neighbor noticed too. Mrs. Thompson, an elderly woman who often sat on her porch, sometimes called me over and offered me a piece of cornbread or a slice of peach. "You're too thin, child," she'd say. Her words seemed simple, but her eyes held questions she didn't ask. In them I felt seen. I started inventing excuses to leave the house. Errands to the market, visits to classmates. He seldom allowed it, but when he did, the air outside tasted like freedom. Those brief escapes reminded me that the world was bigger than the cage he had built around me. My siblings and I developed a silent language, a glance, a squeeze of the hand, a nod, small signals to warn each other when danger was near. It wasn't much, but it was ours. That code of survival was our first act of rebellion together. Some nights, when I knew he was asleep, I wrote my feelings on scraps of paper. Letters to no one, confessions I later burned in the fire. Watching the words curl into smoke made me feel lighter, as though a piece of my burden floated away. Even my body became a tool of resistance. I learned to hide my fear, to keep my hands from trembling, to swallow my tears. He searched for weakness, shaking, crying, breaking. When I denied him that satisfaction, I felt a quiet victory. One morning, I made a decision. That day, I would not cry, no matter what. And I didn't. Even under his shouts, even with his looming presence, I held his gaze steady. My insides quaked. But outside, I stood firm. That tiny act filled me with fire. Hope began to grow from these small victories. Not enough to free me yet, but enough to remind me I had power inside me, however hidden. That power was my secret treasure. Mrs. Thompson, without knowing, became my inspiration. She often told me, life can be harsh, but never forget who you are. I carried those words like an amulet, repeating them when I felt weakest. My uncle was still the master of the house, but I was building a secret place he could never reach, my mind. There, in silence, I kept my strength, my refusal to break, and each day, with every hidden gesture, every steady look, I moved closer to the moment when silence would no longer be my prison, but my weapon. The breaking point came without warning, the way storms sometimes roll in from a clear sky. It was a cold night, the wind rattling the windows, and I was in the kitchen washing dishes. My siblings were asleep, and my father snored softly in his chair. Then he entered, my uncle, with cloudy eyes, a half-empty glass of whiskey in his hand, and that crooked smile that always froze me in place. He told me to stay. His voice was too soft, almost gentle, and that frightened me more than his usual anger. The quiet of the house pressed against me, making me feel trapped. My chest tightened, and I could hear my own heartbeat louder than the wind outside. When he stepped closer, something inside me snapped. It wasn't courage in the heroic sense. It was raw instinct, the pure will to survive. I backed away and grabbed the kitchen knife from the counter, clutching it with trembling hands. "No," I said, for the first time aloud, my voice firmer than I thought possible. He stopped, startled, as though he had never imagined I could defy him. His eyes locked on mine, and for a moment the world seemed frozen. Then he smirked, dismissive, and took another step. But this time, I didn't retreat. The knife glinted in the dim light, and my eyes refused to look away. I don't know where the strength came from, but a scream ripped out of me. A scream so loud, so desperate, that it shook the walls and woke my siblings and father. They rushed in, and the kitchen filled with a silence so heavy it pressed on all of us. My uncle stammered excuses, claiming I had misunderstood, that it was nothing. But my brothers stood at my side, my father too, their faces pale but resolute. And I, still clutching the knife, shaking but unbroken, did not lower my gaze. For the first time, I saw him step back, not out of fear of me, but because he realized he had lost something, control. That night the balance of power shifted, and though the shadow of his presence still lingered, it no longer crushed us in the same way. The days that followed were filled with tension. He did not leave immediately, but his authority was cracked. He no longer spoke with the same force, no longer looked at me with that same ownership. My scream had split something open, and he could not seal it again. The cost was heavy. Nightmares haunted me, replaying his face, his laugh, the knife in my hands. I woke drenched in sweat, heart racing, but in the middle of that fear was something new, a strange certainty that I was not powerless. One afternoon, I looked into the broken mirror in our kitchen. For the first time, I didn't see only fear in the girl staring back. I saw fire. My reflection whispered back to me, "You're not his prey anymore." That moment marked a shift inside me. It didn't mean the nightmare was over, but it meant I was no longer the same child. Something had changed, a seed of rebellion planted deep within me. I had cracked the silence, I had shouted, and once a voice breaks free, it can never be fully caged again. That truth became my strength. If this part of my story touched you, I ask you gently, leave a like, share it, let others find courage in it. Your support keeps this voice alive, a voice that once was buried in silence. That breaking point taught me that fear is immense, But when the will to live awakens, it can be greater. From that night forward, I knew I would never be the same again. The end didn't come all at once, but like a tide slowly pulling back from the shore. After that night with the knife, nothing in our house was the same. My uncle stayed for a while longer, but his hold on us was broken. I was no longer the silent, obedient girl he could command without resistance. Something in me had awakened that could not be silenced again. As months passed, the tension grew unbearable. Whispers spread. Through town, neighbors began to notice cracks in his mask. And then one day, he left, claiming business elsewhere, walking out as suddenly as he had walked in. He never returned. His absence didn't erase the scars he left behind. But for the first time in years, we could breathe again. Life carried on, though never the same. My siblings and I learned to care for one another, to protect what little we had left. I grew up with a quiet vow burning inside me. Never again would I allow anyone to steal my voice. Silence had once been my prison. Now it became my testimony. At night I sometimes dream of my mother. I imagine her voice, her hands shielding us. I like to think that in that moment when I screamed and raised the knife, it was her strength flowing through me. That thought comforts me, that she didn't abandon me entirely, that a piece of her remained to guide me. Now, at 78, I look back not with pride, but with relief. Relief that I survived, that I broke free from the silence that almost swallowed me whole. People see me as the old woman with the floral dress tending her garden. But beneath each flower lies a root that once grew in darkness and still found a way to bloom. It took years to free myself from guilt. For too long, I thought I had been weak, that I had allowed everything to happen. But growing older taught me the truth. The guilt was never mine. Understanding that was the deepest liberation of all. That's why I tell my story today. Not to invite pity, not to stir anger, but to let someone out there know that even in silence, a spark can survive. And that spark, however small, can one day become a flame strong enough to change everything. If this story spoke to you, I ask gently, leave a like, subscribe, and share it. Your support gives me the strength to keep telling these stories. And tell me in the comments what you felt while listening. Because only when we share our truths do our scars turn from chains into reminders, proof that we survived